I am going to get us started here. I am Derek Bruff, Assistant Provost and Executive Director of the Vanderbilt University Center for Teaching, and I would like to welcome you all to this very special panel celebrating the Center for Teaching's 35th anniversary. The CFT was founded in 1986 by Ken Bain, who you may know from his book, What the Best College Teachers Do, among others, or from the other teaching centers he founded after ours. We started off as a small unit within the College of Arts and Science here at Vanderbilt, but soon moved over to the provost office where we began serving the entire university campus and its teaching community. At this point in our career, we have 14 full-time staff and a number of graduate fellows in various positions. And I like to think that after last year especially, and the work that we did supporting our campus's move to online and hybrid teaching, that our value to our campus has never been more clear. I have worked for the Center for Teaching for half of its existence, just over half at this point. I started here as a graduate fellow in 2001, and then I joined the staff in 2005. Been here since then. As I have stuck around, I have seen staff and grad fellows come and go, and I have marveled at the careers that they have made for themselves. I may be a little bit biased, but I think our alumni pool is maybe the most fantastic group of alumni of any teaching center in the United States. And when it came time to celebrate our 35th anniversary, I wanted to honor and shine a light on that fantastic alumni group, and that's why we have this panel here today. I'm going to let our moderator introduce the panel, but I have the pleasure of introducing our moderator. I think I first met Allison Pingree probably in 1998 at Teaching Assistant Orientation. It was, I think, her first TAO at Vanderbilt as director of the Center for Teaching. It was mine because I was a participant, a brand new grad student that fall. I benefited greatly from the services of the Center for Teaching as a graduate student instructor in the math department at Vanderbilt. And because of that, I went on to work for a couple of years as a grad fellow at the CFT. And really that experience more than anything launched my career in educational development. And I owe that to Allison. I was honored when she brought me on as an assistant director in 2005, and I continued to be honored to count her as a mentor and a friend. Allison had 13 fantastic years directing the Center for Teaching at Vanderbilt University, and then she moved on to the Harvard Kennedy Graduate School of Education, where she is now a senior instructional coach at the Teaching and Learning Lab there. She is one of the kindest, wisest people I know, and she also happens to be a fantastic moderator. And so I couldn't think of a better pick to moderate our panel here today. And with that, Allison, I will turn it over to you.
Oh, goodness. Wow. Derek, thank you so much. What a beautiful, beautiful welcome and set of kind words. I have so many emotions in coming today and preparing to see all of you. And if Derek can put up the two slides that I prepared, one is incredibly logistical and the other I will unpack shortly. So I wish that we were all in the same place, but it's also true that this wouldn't be happening if we were all if we could all be in the same place. So we are using the affordances of Zoom and technology to make a community together for an hour. So to help us with that, a few things. It's beautiful, wonderful to see all of your faces, and I hope that you can keep your cameras on for as long as you're comfortable. Because we have so many in the audience here, if you can mute yourself until or unless called upon to join in. Derek is serving as our voice of the chat. He even has a background to go with it. And he'll be looking at comments and questions. There you go. And periodically we'll be drawing on your input from you, the participants across the country and perhaps the world. We are going to be recording, we are in fact already recording, and so if for any reason you'd prefer not to be seen on camera, then of course make that choice to turn your camera off. But really, really happy to welcome you all. So if we can go to the next slide. So very soon, it's the Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead. And many, many years ago, Jody Lentz, a facilitator extraordinaire, worked with our center to help us plan for the future and reflect on the past. And he is a Legos guy. So he had us create the Center for Teaching using Legos, and including ourselves. And so I tried to choose something akin to an orchestra conductor. This was the best I could do with the Legos that were available. But because we had said goodbye to many staff at that time and were welcoming new members of our team, I also was drawn to this little skeleton. Who knew that Legos had a skeleton in the mix, but they did. And I still have this piece. To me, it represents the opportunity, the challenge, and the riches of being able to see the past, honor it, celebrate it, grieve it, have it with us, but not have it control us, and not have it trap us, so that we can live fully in the present, even as we then prepare for, envision, and look to the future. So thank you to Jody, he's here, and to all of you who have made the Center for Teaching at Vanderbilt University what it has been in the past. I know Susan Wiltshire is here. She gave, I think, the first workshop ever at the CFT. So we honor so many who have contributed. And I've been so delighted to see all the things that the Center for Teaching has become since I left Vanderbilt 10 years ago. And I know great things are in store for it. So I'm happy to welcome some phenomenal panelists to join in conversation with today. We will be taking a cue from what I just said, which is we will first be thinking a bit about what the session, what the Center for Teaching has meant in the past to us. I've asked the panelists, who I'll introduce briefly momentarily, to think about what they enjoyed most about being at the center, what did they feel proudest about, what were their roles. So just a moment of the past. So that'll be our kind of honoring the past. Then we'll think about the present. And I've asked them to think about how in their current work has it mattered that they worked at the Vanderbilt Center for Teaching? How has it impacted them? What skills or insights do they still use that they gained there? And then I've asked them to pull out their crystal balls a little bit, which is always a dangerous thing, but nonetheless, we're going to try to think about what lies ahead from their multiple perspectives in higher ed. What do they see as key issues, challenges in higher ed generally for teaching and learning, but specifically as well for educational development, teaching and learning centers. So I've asked them to take just 2 to 3 minutes to answer a question. We're going to do some lightning rounds, and in each of these rounds, then we'll build in some time to hear from you, our audience, to share comments or questions. We won't be able to hear all of them or take up all of them in the large group, but Derek will choose a few as we have time. And perhaps the panelists themselves will want to comment on or ask questions of each other. The time will go very quickly, and so let's dive in, knowing that it will be imperfect and incomplete, but joyous nonetheless. So just very briefly, and so we have Peter Felton, who is Assistant Provost for Teaching and Learning and Executive Director of the Center for Engaged Learning and a Professor of History at Elon, a former Associate Director. We have Brielle Harbin, who's an Assistant Professor of Political Science at the United States Naval Academy, who was a graduate teaching fellow at the center. We have Shedrick McClendon, a higher education consultant and senior partner at Sphinx Global Solutions. And we have Katie Hedrick Taylor, Associate Professor of Learning Sciences and Human Development at the University of Washington. And Shedrick and Katie also were graduate fellows, coming from different stages of the center's growth and coming from very different perspectives, institution types and positions. So I will now open the floor, and we're going to mix up the order of things. So this first round we'll hear Shedrick, then Katie, Brielle, then Peter. So Shedrick, talk to us about what the CFT was like for you. What did you enjoy most about it? What are you proudest of?
Hi, Allison. Good to see you. Good to see Derek and everyone else on this this morning. So I was thinking back. There's so many things that come up for me, positive things that I learned and I was exposed to. So I was trying to figure out where to go with this one. But what comes up for me now is I remember just being exposed to great teaching as we were sort of having folks model teaching before us. We learned techniques that were helpful. There were best practices that we were, learning about. But what I really, really appreciated most was a safe space for reflection. This opportunity to kind of reflect on how we were preparing for class as TAs, how we were sort of making it work in the moment, things that we could improve on. And one example that comes to mind as I was working with folks in terms of consulting was this idea of videotaping and video recording them in the class. That was, like, for me, novel at the moment, at that time. It was another layer of reflection. And so I had a chance to work with folks and just sort of see their eyes, really light up as they were thinking and reflecting on, wow, I did that? How'd that happen? And then actually have it happen to me, where I actually I was actually recorded and had a chance to, look back at my own teaching and just see the blind spots and sort of think about, wow, I didn't realize I did that. So for me, the reflection, the safe space, just was really, really a great time, a great moment for me that was pivotal in my development.
Thank you. Katie.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm so excited to be here. And as Derek and Allison were introducing the panel, I was remembering, like, what a wonderful, humane, loving place the CFT was at a time when grad school was very stressful. So thank you so much for including me in your family. It was a wonderful support. So, but to answer your question, Allison, I think maybe perfect storm wise at that point in graduate school, I started to feel more and more siloed in my sort of disciplinary area. And the CFT really allowed me to, kind of break out of that, right? And work with especially TAs who were instructing in STEM disciplines. And I remember, so I was at Peabody, right, as a graduate student. And so then I remember running several workshops with graduate students who were instructing in microbiology and engineering and mathematics, and really getting a more kind of complex and nuanced understanding of teaching in higher ed, right? Even though I research theories of learning, I was really struck by how instructional practice was so intricately linked to these domains of expertise and the histories of how people were learning in those domains. And so it really, I think, kind of launched me into thinking more sort of systematically about what teaching in higher ed can look like, and the possibilities, right? And how you can bridge those different disciplinary, I don't want to say silos, but programs. And then I also just want to say, I don't know if this is the right time to answer this question, but I also want to say how important it was for me to have the opportunity to work with Nancy Chick was at the CFT at the time, and she was the editor for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. And I got the opportunity to be the editorial manager for that, and was just like, got an inside look before, a tenure track position into peer review process, right? And so I was working very closely with authors. I was, I was supporting people through the steps of peer review and seeing how their pieces about teaching and learning were really developing over time. And so I just thought that was like a really kind of priceless opportunity I got there, among many. So I'll stop there, but thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Brielle.
Morning, or I guess good afternoon to everyone, depending on where you are in the world. So I'm also happy to be here terms of thinking about the work that stands out in my mind. So first of all, I just wanted to piggyback on the comment about Nancy Chick. So I actually transferred grad programs from Brown University to Vanderbilt to finish my PhD. And I was involved with the Center for Teaching at Brown. And I remember the director at that time, when I told her I was leaving to Vanderbilt, said, "Oh, that's where Nancy is. You need to get to know her." So it was really great getting to connect with Nancy before she left. That was a really great experience. But when I was sitting down to think about what had the most influence on me, I think the ability to really think deeply and critically about issues of difference and how they emerged in the classroom. So I was very lucky to be able to be a co-organizer and facilitator of 2 learning communities on race in teaching and gender and sexuality as well. So I did that during my time as a graduate teaching fellow. And that was just a really positive experience. I got to know Joe Bandy really well because we worked on that together. And the first year, the one that we did on race and learning, because of some of the conversations that were happening around like hidden doors and the undergrad population really wanting to have the institution think critically about these questions, was just a campus-wide conversation that we had on some of these issues. And I remember just spending a lot of time talking to Joe in particular about some of the things that we were hearing from faculty members and grad students on these topics, and thinking about how to bring that conversation to the larger community. So I feel very proud and think it was a pretty formative experience in terms of, my own context now, thinking about being in the military and thinking about these issues that I could not have foreseen, but were definitely helpful for me. So I'll leave it at that.
Hi, everybody. It's so nice to see you all. So many old friendly faces, not old faces.
Hey, watch it.
Watch it. And to be fair, as Allison said, there's a plan here. And I knew I was going to be going after Shedrick and Katie and Brielle. And I knew they were going to say really smart stuff about work, about difference, and about discipline and reflection. I didn't know those, but I knew they were going to go deep in that. So I decided to go in a different direction. And then Allison apparently was reading my notes in the preview, because I wanted to talk about the Halloween parties that were at Darlene Panvini's house. And I say that because, Shedrick talked about sort of the spirit of the CFT. And I think those parties really captured that in a couple different ways that are really important. One is just the welcoming. Allison mentioned in the preview that my parents were in town once, and Darlene's like, they have to come. And, that was not, and my children came to these parties and things like this. And so it was a really welcoming and friendly environment. The other thing, though, is it was also serious in its own way. Like, the costumes at this party were not to be trifled with. If you know, probably the best Halloween costume I've ever been in the same room with in my life was Derek Bruff as the farmer in American Gothic. If you don't know the painting American Gothic, I don't have a picture of Derek in this, but you can find it. He had a pitchfork. He had a picture frame so he could be in the frame, right? And to me, that captured something, not just something about Derek, but something about the CFT, this sort of blend of playfulness and rigorous, It was serious, but it was fun. And it was welcoming. And so what I remember most is sort of that blend. And Derek looks exactly like that farmer. Thanks for having me, Derek. I really.
Amen. All right. Well, so we've got a good chunk of time now before we move on to thinking about the present and how this past at the CFT impacts our present. Mr. Chat Guy, voice of the chat, talk to us about some things that are coming up. And if and as any of you have a question now that you'd like to ask or a comment to make, please put it in the chat, and Derek's going to curate that for us.
No questions or comments thus far, other than some very cheerful greetings in the chat. I did want to reflect, because Shedrick and I were actually grad students at the CFT the same year. And so I can certainly echo his comment about the Center for Teaching being a space for reflection and kind of stepping back and thinking about our teaching practice and the ways that we navigate higher education. And I'll echo Katie's comment about having these interdisciplinary conversations, because I remember having really deep conversations about teaching and learning with other graduate students from Peabody, our School of Education, our sociology department, our English department, and having spent 3 solid years, holed up in the math department, taking classes and doing research, it was really refreshing to have those interdisciplinary conversations. And so I just want to echo that.
Wonderful. Well, I'll maybe just add a little myself, and then we'll shift to the present. And I think, looking at so many people on this call, I see Richard Haglund, and I remember emailing you, Richard, when I was thinking about taking the job and asking, okay, what's the real skivvy on Jack Venable? And you were very, sort of truthful and fair. And to me, the time at Vanderbilt was a time, when I got this job, nobody thought that I was ready for it. I was very new in the field, and I had mentors who were extraordinary. Susan Wiltshire, so many others who are here, Mary Dean, so many, and going to the pod conference every year, I got more mentoring to bring back home. And the search committee who hired me most of them became the advisory board for the center. And I think, to me, what Vanderbilt and the Center for Teaching in particular meant to me was a community of support, a community of challenge, but a community where I could turn to people, lean on people, look for help, get it, and then some. So I just have so much gratitude, and for previous directors as well, Linda and Ken. So just a kind of naming and honoring of all that people have brought to the center over time. All right. So now our order is going to be, let's see, where did I put it? Okay, Brielle, then Peter, then Katie, then Shedrick. So tell us a little bit about your current work. I was very brief in my introduction, and in a moment I'm going to put a PDF in the chat that has much more detail about everybody. But what difference does it make to you right now that you worked at the center? Is there a concrete skill or insight or something that you think would be different if you hadn't had this experience? So, Brielle.
Great. So I am an assistant professor. So I am a political scientist by training. So I'm not sure if this would be different with the CFT, but I am teaching a class this semester. I created a class at the Naval Academy, the first of its kind, that's a race, gender, class, and sexuality in US politics. So all the things that I was thinking about in terms of how to have these conversations, thinking through the issues of how to meet students where they are, I was, learning about that and thinking about that from the time that I was a grad student. And so I think that the translation into, as a civilian in particular, the military context, and thinking about how to approach the conversation with literally students that come from every congressional district, and so have very different viewpoints when entering into this conversation has just, it was an invaluable experience. So that's just on a broad level, a concrete example of how that comes to mind in terms of how the skills that I was developing as a grad student have helped me in my career. I literally just gave a campus-wide talk on issues of diversity in organizations that literally had one of the former directors of the CIA in the audience. And so being able to, I think because I've had such a long history of thinking about these things, I think it prepared me and was able to have the space to think about those things in the context of developing my research and my service orientation. I just don't think that I would have been able to step into these conversations or think about it in the same way if I wouldn't have had that time to develop myself as a grad student. So I think that it was an invaluable experience in both the ways that I grew and also the challenges that I had with trying to do that work.
Wonderful. Thank you. Peter.
Hi again. And unlike Brielle, I already was a PhD. I was a professional in some way or shape when I started at CFT. And there's two things I'm really thinking about with this one. One is, I'm trained as a historian. I went to grad school as a historian. I did that as a historian. Then I worked at a community college for a few years before Allison called. And I was trained to work entirely by myself. I mean, that's how historians work, right? And that's how teaching works. And so one of the things that really fundamentally reoriented how I am as a professional and how I am in the world is the relational work at the CFT, working with peers closely on things, not just you do this, I do that. And even doing things like we used to have this, I can't remember what the acronym was, where we would read an article and eat bagels and talk about stuff. And I had never really, except in graduate seminars, talked about scholarship with people, except students that I sort of preached to. So that that blending of things was really important and is fundamental to who I am and how I work. Now, the other thing that's really, really important, and I want to give a shout out to people like Marshall Aiken on this, even if he doesn't know it, is again, I came into the CFT and there was the history part of me and there was the teaching and learning part of me. And it felt like those were fundamentally in tension. I could do one or I could do the other. And there's something wonderful about the way Allison and others, Marshall, helped me think about this is both and, it's not either or. And that's been fundamental in sort of how I do my work. So the research and writing I do now actually draws a lot on my oral history training, which confuses lots of people because they're like, what? But it does, right? That's basically what I'm doing is contemporary oral histories. So, anyways, this sort of integrative and holistic and human thing is really the key for me.
Love it. Yes, thank you. Katie.
Wow, I think I'm going to echo both Brielle and Peter on this, but I can't overemphasize how collaborative the space was at the Center for Teaching and how that really prepared me to not just think about supporting my current graduate students around research, but also supporting them around their own instruction. And so, I have several PhD advisees now who are teaching in our undergrad program. And though many of them are researching, learning in various contexts, they have less or might be out of practice translating that theory into their own instruction with undergraduates. And so, my time at the Center for Teaching really just, I think, developed a practice in myself to be continuously collaborating around how we can be better instructors, how teaching is really, in reciprocity with your students, how to make your practice really public and visible all the time, and not to be like shy about that, and to be open about your failures, and to be able to workshop those together, right? And so again, just like underscoring this idea of that constant collaboration in the Center for Teaching really did develop this community of practice, but also I think launched me into this next stage of my career to really try to develop that with my own doc students. And so that was a amazing, like Peter was saying, that was an amazing sort of kind of breakout moment where we get to talk to each other all the time and not sit in our offices and stare at walls or computer screens. So that was a really important piece of professional practice for me.
Yeah, Wonderful. Shedrick.
Yes, so currently I spend most of my time doing sort of DEI consulting, do some student success consulting. In my most recent institutions, I was assistant dean students, working dean's office in school education, school public health. So what I remember, one concrete thing that stands out for me, and many folks from my time will remember this, there was a session around how to lead effective discussions, or how do you make sure that in your classes, the discussion keeps going and it's effective. And I remember teaching that myself, or at least leading that discussion at a couple of the TAOs, a couple of different sessions. And so going into my own professional space, it was like, how do I remember thinking back, either in a classroom setting or even like leading a meeting, in terms of just how I shape the conversation, how I sort of start and lead throughout. And so that's been one thing that I can remember from the late 90s, those techniques that we learned, just in terms of, especially for the faculty side of things, but even in my administrative life. One other quick thing I want to just throw in here while I have the floor, in the dean's office, at least one place I can remember, there was always this discussion about the importance of the pedagogy class that we were offering our students. And I remember a couple of times, it was on the chopping block, right when the budget was tight, and it was like, well, can our students take the classes over in social work? Do we have to have these 2 or 3 sections that we have in our own school? And I remember like saying, yes, we have to keep it. It's so important that we have our own courses for our students, our TAs, because of course it was required for all new TAs to have a pedagogy class. And typically it was taught in their school, in their college. But if they had issues with, there was a conflict, they go to history or social work, social welfare, social work, or another campus, another college. And so I remember many times advocating and sort of standing up to the CFO or my dean colleagues saying, no, we really need to invest in our students and our own TAs. And from my experience, knowing how important it was, and knowing how important it was even to have it in the context of our school. So anyway, that went with me many times, my sort of CFT training and experience into the dean's conference rooms, as I was sort of advocating for that.
Thank you. I'm seeing in the chat several others who have also had experiences at the CFT, who have gone on to other CFTs, naming some of the impacts for them. Derek, are there particular questions or comments you want to lift up here for a few minutes?
Yeah, I'd like to share a question from Ransford Pinto, who is our current assistant director for graduate programs. And it's an interpolation question, I guess. We've talked about your time at the CFT and where you are now, but he asked about that kind of transition. How did, for the grad fellows on the panel, how did your time at the CFT help prepare you for that first job or that first position after Vanderbilt? And what advice might you have for graduate students who are working at our Center for Teaching or other teaching centers right now?
I can jump in if it's not someone else who wants to go first. So what comes to mind is that I think especially among my peers, not particularly at this institution, but just in general that I've talked to who have thought about that pivot from grad student to being the instructor of record, is that there's certain language and a certain degree of philosophy or pedagogy that goes into running a course in a way that is allowing the wheels to not fall off, that you get introduced to when you are having that conversation early. And so for me, the whole idea of having a learning objective, knowing what a learning objective was, thinking about backward design, which were things that I was introduced to, not just, I did the certificate program and then also taught it. Like, to me, that's indispensable when thinking about trying to put together your first syllabus as an instructor. Now, with that said, I think what I saw in my transition is that I knew what a learning objective was. So there was a different challenge with, okay, so how does the theory actually meet the day-to-day practice? And sometimes when you think about some of the theories of teaching people, then you get on the ground and you're like, okay, what's the reality of what this looks like in the day today? And I think that if I didn't have that language, if I wasn't familiar with the scholarship of teaching and learning, then I might have felt overwhelmed by trying to figure out how to overcome some of the challenges that I had when I was first teaching. And so for me, I think there is kind of like, that there's a floor that exists, but then when it gets, the rug is grabbed up out from under you when you're teaching that first course and you're trying to figure out, oh my gosh, what do I actually do in the day-to-day? Having the knowledge that literature exists it was really helpful to me, so that I knew where to go to get some ideas about how I might, tackle some of the dynamics that came up in my class.
Wow, thank you. Yeah. Anyone else? We've got a couple more minutes. Any other panelists who want to speak to this question?
I'll just say that I'm in a college of education, and I didn't have formal P12 teaching on my CV. I had been teaching in sort of informal contexts with youth serving organizations while I was at Vanderbilt, and also before that. But most faculty in colleges of ed, I don't know if most, but many faculty in the colleges of ed have experience in K-12 classrooms. And so I think having the Center for Teaching, having that experience from the Center for Teaching on my CV, and showing that I had a particular sort of orientation to kind of iterating instruction and co-designing instruction and those sorts of instructional practices, I think really helped who knows, search committees are odd creatures in and of themselves, but perhaps I think that helped just to illustrate that like Brielle is saying, I had, some confidence, even though I had confidence teaching, even though I didn't have K-12 experience in those contexts. So that's great.
Yeah. And I'm seeing Mary Wright's question about kind of how the center's approach has changed over time. Maybe we'll kind of put a pin in that and get to that in a moment, because Mary, I think a lot of us will have some things to say to that. Well, so we've talked about what the center meant way back when, or not so way back when. We talked about how it's the strands or the threads of its tapestry, continue to weave into our own. So what does the future hold? In mentioning the Day of the Dead and in mentioning honoring the past at the beginning, I was and I am mindful of how much loss we've all experienced over the past close to 2 years, a year and a half, and what kinds of reckonings, what kinds of disruptions, what kinds of just cracking open into new possibilities, as well as horrifying gaps that we've seen. And so, I don't think it's hyperbole to say that higher education has changed, more than dramatic, has irrevocably changed, and thus teaching and learning in higher education has changed. Thus, educational development and the teaching and learning centers that support it have changed. So, as we think together about what are the changes that we especially want to be paying attention to, either what are you most worried about and excited about, or in thinking about educational development and teaching and learning centers in particular, what should we be focusing on in the next few years? What's an opportunity that we must seize, and what's a challenge that we really are going to need to take on? So here the order will be Katie, then Shedrick, then Peter, and then Brielle. Katie. Okay.
I will, Allison, you used the word reckoning. I think that's really appropriate for the moment that we're in regarding higher teaching and higher ed. But I don't want to be negative, but I do worry a lot about the pressure and the increasing pressure and shift to online learning and instruction. And I say that knowing that it has been a real asset for many people to be able to, access classrooms online. So I absolutely hold that to be a truth. And I also hold that when we move our instruction to Zoom, for instance, or there are other platforms, of course, that we've all played with. I just played with one called Oh Yay. I think that was developed. Derek probably knows about it at Harvard, maybe. But I really feel like we're losing so many sense-making modes of our bodies when we are just sitting like we are now, right behind or in front of a computer screen. And I think this has real impacts on how we can collaborate with one another. I think it has really big impacts for the kinds of tools that I'm not just talking about digital tools, but all kinds of tools that we are kind of practicing with and becoming efficacious with. I think it has impacts for how we connect to and relate to places and spaces, and the richness that is in communities that aren't digital. And my job is to study, digitally remediated teaching and learning. So I'm not like I'm not saying we should ignore or refuse digital tools, but I think we have to hold the physical and the digital up next to each other and really understand our reasons for being for engaging with one over the other. So I worry about that a lot. I know that we're getting more and more pressure. The pressure was there before COVID, and so now it's ratcheting up to really move instruction online. And so I think that's a real tension. So but I do want to end on a positive note, which is I am so excited to see the increasing diversity in my classrooms, especially my undergrad classrooms, students who identify as BIPOC, who are international students, who identify as queer, and really how their perspectives are really transforming the kinds of conversations that we can have in classrooms, and also not just conversations, but kind of the traditional sorts of modes of instruction and interaction. And I'm so excited, and that's a goal that we have as a public institution at UW, but I really think that we need to keep moving in that direction. So I'll stop there. That was an exciting thing. I wanted to end on a positive note.
Absolutely. Very rich. Thank you so much. Shedrick, a concern, a hope, an excitement. What are you seeing?
Yeah. Yes. I think I would say a concern and a hope. I'll kind of mix them together. I really hope that centers will invest time and energy into anti-racist pedagogy, and just really realize the moment that we're in now, how important it is that our faculty get the support they need, whether it's one-on-one professional support or however it's done. But I've had several students in the last year or so describe what trauma has looked like for them in a classroom, and not just with white faculty, but even faculty of color struggle to navigate some of the microaggressions that happen in the classroom. It could happen when a guest speaker comes. It could happen with a conversation across peers. It could happen with the reading that was assigned. I just really hope that we see the value investing time and energy and time resources into what anti-racist pedagogy and what equitable pedagogy support looks like. I know some campuses are already doing this, but it's just so important. And then seizing the opportunity that we have now in this moment in our country. There is a conversation. There's a national discussion happening, right? There's a narrative that we're all a part of, given what's happened in the last year or two. So I think that's important that we double down there. And then I guess one positive thing to do what Katie did. One positive thing to end on is that I am seeing that more campuses are seeing value in CFTs, and they're I've seen examples of how they put more resources into the sort of central center, which is great. Many campuses have centers embedded within the schools and colleges, which is great. And so I think just sort of seeing that movement across the country is great. Of course, Vanderbilt and other universities, I see Mary Dean on here from UMass. Other universities have done this for a long, long time. But to see more campuses coming on to really see the value of CFTs and investing in grad students and fellowship programs like we've had at Vanderbilt for many years. I think it's really, really important and a good thing to see.
Great, thank you. And Joe, thank you so much for putting the link in the chat, and more importantly, for the work that you've been doing for many, many years at Vanderbilt. Joe Bandy here in these spaces. Let's see, Peter.
Hi again. Partly I just want to cede the floor back to Katie and Shedrick so they can keep explaining the key things we need to do, because I agree completely. I want to approach in some ways the same thing from a different angle. I'm going to put a link in the chat to an article that came out in 2017 that written by two colleagues, Katarina Mortensen and Torgny Roksa at Lund University in Sweden. And the background here is they had a cultural anthropologist sit in their center for a year to observe the work of the center. And then this person wrote a paper describing the work of the center. And it said, the center is really amazing in how it bends faculty to the neoliberal aims of the university. And Katarina and Torgny were crushed by that and disturbed by this. And so they ask in this question, in this article, are we liberating faculty and students in our institutions through our work, or are we constraining them? And so Shedrick and Katie are both talking about that. And I think the hopeful part of me, I'm not going to probably end with hope, I'll end with despair, just to counter. But the hopeful part of me is, the last year, lots and lots of trauma, but also lots and lots and lots of change, right? And so it's possible to see change. The historian in me just recognizes that people always think now is different, and big change is happening. And what tends to happen is, a little change and then we go back, little change and we go back. And so I really think we in our teaching, we in our work in educational development need to do what Shedrick and Katie and Torgny and Katarina are saying and really lean into this liberatory role of our work. I mean, if we can't answer the question, how does our teaching, how does our curriculum, how does our educational development engage with the grand challenges of our communities and our world? Like, what are we doing? And why are we doing this? I want to make a really important distinction. Of course, our research should be like an ivory tower, right? The research doesn't necessarily need to be framed within the current moment of the world. There's so much power in studying, 19th century Brazil or something like that without saying, how is this relevant now? But I don't think our teaching responsibly can be apart from COVID and Black Lives Matter and climate change and threats to democracy. And I actually think the distrust in higher education and distrust and expertise in our country and in our world is partly because we've done such a lousy job of leaning into these things. And so it's not surprising if students and communities don't see our work connecting with the questions that matter to them. It's not surprising. They think their goal should be to get in, get through, get out of education, get a job, and get on with your life. The end.
Hear, hear. And Peter's work and the many books and articles and collaborations he's been involved with over the years are testament to the really powerful I would go beyond invitations, not quite Jeremiad, but we'll give you a Jeremiad to the Jeremiad and the challenges that you're naming, and I think rightly so. So thank you. Last and certainly not least on this question, Brielle.
Great. So yeah, a lot of what has been said I agree with, and I guess I'll just amplify some of the things that have been said, just in terms of thinking about hope. I think one of the perhaps a tragic irony of this moment is that a silver lining is that, of this moment is that it really put up a mirror to all of us in terms of thinking about some of these issues of equity and inclusivity And especially for me, coming from the perspective of being at an institution where I literally have students who are coming from every congressional district. Like, I mean, I had students the spring of 2020, who one of my students literally had to use her phone as a hotspot in order to be able to use the learning management system to take the test, right? And so some of these, what the moment forced us to see is just, it made it very clear how much difference there is, and what it raised different types of questions about equity and forced people to sit with them in a way that I don't think would have been possible outside of that pandemic context. And so my hope would be that, you know, we're not myopic, that we hold on to some of these lessons that we've learned about how we can make learning more accessible to people, and that we walk away from it with these choices not being about making it easier or harder for certain groups, but just an issue of making everything equitable. That's why we choose to do these things. And then I think just in terms of where I hope we go, and what I hope is an extension of this moment that we've just been in, is thinking about the way that I see it. And Joe and I are co-authors and have been publishing a lot on this issue of thinking about cognitive versus affective dimensions of learning. And I think we have spent a lot of time thinking about the cognitive aspects of it, but this moment has forced us to think about the affective aspects. So what are our students bringing, you know, in the context of COVID to class, in terms of thinking about how it's affecting their learning, but also thinking about these issues of broader questions of democratic citizenship, preparing people to be citizens of the world, to be members of the community, and how our classrooms are places to not only focus on, you know, some of the cognitive aspects of, you know, XY theory, but do you have the soft skills of being able to talk to your neighbor, to communicate with people who are different than you? I really hope, and Joe and I think, I don't want to speak for him, or based on the reception to our work, are feeling a bit more optimistic about these questions, but I think a lot more work has to be done, because on thinking about this affective component, mainly because that's the messier work, that's the harder work, that's harder to measure in a given class. Like when you think about somebody cultivating skills to communicate with people who are different from them, that might not be something that you see in a single semester. So you need to think about revisions to curriculum to actually track those types of skills. Those are larger institutional questions. And so I hope that one of the legacies of this moment is that we start asking ourselves and our institutions those larger questions. And I'm really excited to dig in and do some of that hard work, especially as a political scientist, thinking about things like democratic backsliding, democratic citizenship. What does it mean to be a member of this community, or things that I'm thinking about in both my research and my teaching. And so I hope that we can find in other disciplinary contexts bridges for those conversations as well.
Thank you. My goodness, this is incredibly rich. And I'm seeing several different themes in the chat around honoring the scholarly work of the center, lifting up the work that Joe, Brielle, and others have done, more particularly around race and anti-oppressive liberatory work. We're a couple of different directions we could go, and one would be the kind of the changing structures and changing approaches of CFT, of CTL, Centers for Teaching and Learning, with a particular focus on anti-racist work. Derek, are there other things that you're seeing in the chat that you want, or things you want to lift up?
Yeah, I was going to ask the structural question and see if anyone had comments on that. And then Susan Wiltshire would like to share a story before we wrap up. Okay, so this is Mary Wright's question. Let's see. Do you want to? Can you? Yeah, maybe I'll frame it. So, yeah. So given the worries, the concerns, and the opportunities that we've just talked about, and maybe I'll broaden it a little bit away from just teaching centers, but certainly feel free to talk about teaching centers. What advice would you give to administrators who are thinking about structural ways, levers they can pull to address some of these?
I'll jump in, and I don't
Keep
have
the
a
administrator.
solution, but I just want to name a tension that I think is really important to be attended to. One is that one of the powers of places like the CFT is that faculty and grad students come to it sort of their own volition, with their own questions and their own concerns. And, and the CFT is responsive to that and supportive of that. And then that's in tension in some ways with the CFT having a very strong agenda around doing X or Y or Z. And so I don't think it has to be an irresolvable tension, but I think it's one we just need to attend to. And I think one of the paths through it comes out, there's a wonderful book, Faculty Development and Student Learning by Bill Condon and some other colleagues that did a longitudinal study of a couple institutions and what happens from faculty development. And one of the things they found in that is that faculty, they weren't looking at grad students, want to do work that's valuable, that they think is meaningful. And so if centers are about quick tips and stuff like this, faculty dismiss it. But perhaps if centers are about equity and anti-racism and climate change or democracy, and that's not the only thing they do, but that's a core theme of what they do, then I wonder if faculty and institutions might actually value the work of the centers. We see that with COVID, certainly. All of a sudden, everyone's like, oh my God, we need the center, right? So maybe there's other ways we can frame our work as having connection to those big issues.
Yeah. Anybody else? I was going to ask for you, Peter, or sorry, for an elaboration about the Cumberland project in a second in connection to climate change, but any other panelists who want to weigh in on the structural question and like what you would want administrators to know or to do concretely? Touched on a fair bit already, Brielle.
Yeah, I think just one thing, and I think one tension so I'm not yet tenured, and thinking about some of these questions from the perspective of people who are on the tenure track, I think that there's an institutional disincentive for being leaders in some of the difficult top conversations on some of these issues. So, when we're thinking about the mission of equity, of anti-racism, I think it's one thing to say that those should be commitments that individuals make, but there need to be institutional supports for that. And what that looks like when you are bringing those ideas to the classroom and facing different levels of backlash. And so I think that this is just like a more fundamental question of thinking about the ways in which we think about student evaluations, how you think about parsing the value of allowing students to serve as an alarm, on things that might be problematic in the classroom, but also providing protection to faculty who are just saying things that are hard to hear for certain students. And so I think that requires a broader conversation of how do we keep the parts of this that are useful, and then how do we also think about the function, or are we thinking about the function that these are playing, and how can we kind of hold on to all the ways that this tool is being used, and create structures that make it an incentive for people to engage these questions. Because for me, I totally, as somebody who is like brave in these conversations and is known as the person who's going to be the person who's loud and yells about equity, and I'm okay with that, I also understand the person who doesn't do that. And so how to bridge that gap is, I think, the biggest question. And I think institutions have to play the role in that.
Thank you. It's an incredibly important perspective on the realistic challenges for different positions that we occupy. So Susan, can you tell your story in about 30 to 60 seconds?
I'll try. I think there have been tears of joy for me hearing all of this. And with Brielle's course at the Naval Academy on race, gender, and sexuality, I thought about how the key word here is respect, and respect for self and difference in our community. And there were no CFTs in 1967, but in my very first class of teaching, I had one student who taught me how to teach when he said, "I don't think you've ever taught before, but I know a book that might help you." The book was Teacher by Sylvia Ashton Warner, who threw away the British colonial textbook she was given teaching Maori children, asked them to tell her stories they had heard at home, wrote them down, and taught the children to read from their own stories. That's what we do. We listen to stories, we take people where they are, and we grow together.
Susan, thank you. I can't think of a better way to end our time here together. Love to all of you, and let's carry on this good, important, vital work. Thank you for being here.
And thank you especially to our panelists and to Allison for moderating today. This was just really a big treasure. Thank you. And please do stay in touch. Visit our website, follow us on Twitter. We'd love to continue these conversations with you. Thanks again for being here today.